All right, kindly indicate your willingness to be recorded by doing something silly or whatnot. Okay, so I'm going to give the the class that I prepared last week on Hanukkah. I guess it's now the 11th or the 12th day of Hanukkah. You know, we don't have 12 days. It's actually kind of an interesting feature of the holiday that it's an 8-day holiday. And that features into its history and how we got to where we are. A friend of mine on Shavuot gave a great shiur once called The History of Us. The us being the Jewish people from 4,000 years ago to 2020. And it's a really cool way of looking at it. It's the history of us. All right, so permit me to share my screen. Okay. So I want to do some of the Talmudic text regarding Hanukkah to give you some idea of the significance to which the rabbis gave to Hanukkah. There is an entire tractate on Rosh Hashanah. There is an entire tractate on Yom Kippur. There is an entire tractate on Sukkot. There is an entire tractate on Pesach. There are 2 tractates on Shabbat and Eruvin. There are about 5 pages in the Talmud dealing with Hanukkah. So let's go, but it's still interesting, fun stuff, not just because of what it's become. It's actually interesting unto its own right. So let's look at the text here. Tanu Rabbanan, our sages taught, mitzvat ner Hanukkah, ner ish uveto. So the essential mitzvah of Hanukkah is 1 candle per household. That's it. V'hamahadrin, and those who are meticulous is the way they have it here. That's actually a very good way of translating it. The verb hadar in Hebrew means to make beautiful. So those who try to make mitzvot beautiful, do it top tier. Ner lechol echad ve'echad. 1 candle per person as opposed to per household. And by the way, at the risk of the obvious, we're going to get to it shortly. This is every night. So the first night you light 1 candle or 1 candle per person. The second night you light 1 candle or 1 candle per person until you get to 8. V'hamahadrin min hamahadrin. So the meticulous amongst the meticulous, the crazy ones. Now you have a bifurcation. Beit Shammai omrim, Yom Rishon madlik shemona, mikan ve'elach pochet ve'holech. On the first day, you light 8. From there on, you diminish until you get down to 1. Uveit Hillel omrim, and Beit Hillel says, and this should look familiar because it's kind of what we do, Yom Rishon madlik ahat, mikan ve'elach mosif ve'holech. On the first day, you light 1. From there on, you add every day. The question is, when you have this mahadrin min hamahadrin, over which there's some dispute between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, different practices, are they riffing on the ordinary practice? In other words, you light 1 candle per household on the first night, and then add if you're Beit Shammai, or start with 8 and then go down? Or are they trying to create a fire hazard and do a riff on the Mahadrin, where each person lights their own Chanukiah, either starting with 1 and going up, or starting with 8 and going down? It's not at all clear. Our practice seems to have evolved to be the second interpretation of the extremist position. Now, part of me says this is actually fitting and appropriate, that Hanukkah is a holiday by and about extremists. And so, of course, we're going to take the most fanatical position out there. But be that as it may. So you've got this point of dispute between Beit Hillel and Shammai, which the Talmud would explicate even if it didn't serve a particular halachic purpose. But as this is now the common practice, and probably was already by then, They're going to tell you what's the deal with it. Okay, why? Why does Hillel do what Hillel? Why does Beit Hillel do what Beit Hillel does? Why does Beit Shammai do what Beit Shammai does? Amar Ula, pligi be tere Amorae b'ma'arava. So two Amoraim, late guys in the Talmud, from the west, meaning Eretz Israel, dispute the reason for it. Rabbi Yossi bar Avin Rabbi Yossi bar Zaveda. Had Amar. So before we even get to what the explication is, this is an interesting moment because you have two Amoraim, similar names, and we know that they had a dispute, but we don't know which one said which side of the argument. For those of you like me who have a poor memory for names, this should act as salve to your heart, that you're not the first one to remember, to not be able to remember who said what in an argument. So one says, Hadamar, Ta'ama de Beit Shammai, Keneged Yamim Hanichnasim. So it's the number of days that have yet to come, the incoming days. The Ta'ama de Beit Hillel, Keneged Yamim Hayotzein. Whereas Beit Hillel does the number of days that, as it were, have happened. So on the first night, that's the first day, that's now happening. So you do that day. So Shammai is kind of forward-looking and Hillel is kind of backward-looking by this logic. V'had amar, Tama de Beit Shammai, Keneged Parei Hachag. So the other Amora says the logic of Beit Shammai is that the number of candles, in particular their descending order, corresponds to the cows of the holiday. You're going, cows of the holiday, what are they talking about? We'll get there. V'tama de Beit Hillel, de ma'alin b'kodesh ve'ein moridin. Whereas the logic of Hillel, of Beit Hillel, is actually philosophical. And that is, you ascend in matters of sanctity, in levels of sanctity, and you don't diminish. In other words, you make things better as you go. It has nothing to do with the number of days of the holiday. It has nothing to do with the Torah, with the cows of the holiday. It has to do with logic and philosophy. So these Parei HaChag, they're connecting Hanukkah to Sukkot. And you're going, oh, 8-day holiday, just like Sukkot is. Well, except we do the second day of the 8th day, so it becomes a 9-day holiday, at least for the moment. And I don't want to wake Rabbi Ovadia up, but I can hear his ears perking up going, yeah, we're working on that. And I can see Shana smiling, good. So they're connecting Hanukkah to Sukkot. And there's actually a deep connection between them. Okay, let's keep going here. So now you just have another riff on this. We can actually skip it, but for completion purposes, let's do it. Amar Rabba bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabba bar Chana said that Rabbi Yochanan said, and we're going to see Rabbi Yochanan again next week. Shnei zakenim hayu b'Saidan. There were two elders, in Sidon, which is now in southern Lebanon. And generally Judaism moved north after the destruction because that's where the agriculture worked. That's where the persecution was not quite as bad as it was in Judea and south. Echad asa k'Beit Shammai ve'echad asa k'divrei Beit Hillel. One did according to Beit Shammai, one did according to Beit Hillel. This is interesting in its own right. This tells you that, at least in this generation, Beit Shammai was still a thing. It wasn't just an abstraction. You actually had sub-communities of the rabbinic enterprise who were practicing in accordance with Beit Shammai. So Beit Hillel hadn't yet completely won the day. Zenotein ta'am lidvarav keneged parei hachag. One assigned logic to, in other words, explained it, that it was corresponding to the cows of the Sukkot festival, which go in descending order. And the other one, who held by Beit Hillel, explained the logic of one ascends in holiness and one does not descend in holiness. So again, you're trying to get evidence of what happened when. Here you're seeing some of it. Okay. Now you have another interesting historical text, which actually played out in my household. Tanu Rabbanan. Actually, hang on a sec, please. Okay. I was hoping to see if my sister was logged on because she could confirm this, but so hang on a sec. So you're going to have to take my word on this. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan. Ner Chanukah mitzvah lahanicha al petach beto mibachutz. The candle of Hanukkah, notice it's singular here. It's obligatory to place it in the entrance to one's house on the outside. In Jerusalem, it's lovely seeing the small holes they put in the doorposts to have it, and you see hundreds of Chanukiot just walking down the street. But it's facing outwards because, of course, one of the primary functions of the candles is Persuma Nisa, to, early form of not fake news, well, maybe, of publicizing this holiday. V'im haya dar ba'aliyah, manicha b'chalon hasamucha leroshut harabim. If he lives upstairs, he's got an apartment, he places it in the window adjacent to the public thoroughfare. Again, so that people can see it. It's hard to do in really tall buildings. I don't know if they lit Hanukkah candles in the Burj Khalifa in Dubai this year, but that would be a fun thing to see. Uvishat hasakana manicha al shulchano v'dayo. And in time of danger, you place it on your table, and that's sufficient. So my wife and I came from very different circumstances this way. My wife is American born, as am I, but she's of American Jewish lineage going back 150 years or so. So she always placed her Hanukkah candles in the window, as the Baraita tells us to. Whereas my family came from Russia and then the Soviet Union, where you didn't do that if you wanted to live through Christmas. So you placed your Hanukkah candles on the table and you had them fairly short, 20-minute minimum, and you're done. And that's sufficient. So it's like, wait, you do it that way? I'm like, yeah. So, I don't like to tell people, but I told my bar mitzvah student, his bar mitzvah is going to be affected by COVID-19. My father's bar mitzvah was in 1919. So it was slightly interrupted by the pandemic, the flu pandemic of 1919, and the Russian Civil War, and a Ukrainian Cossack pogrom. You think we got it tough? We got it easy. Okay. So now we have, again, this is a fairly late teaching. Amar Rava, tzarich ne'acheret lehishtamesh le'ora. You need another candle there to make use of its light. So Shabbat candles are designed for utility. They're designed to be able to see by. In a world before Thomas Edison, those were your lights for dinner. In fact, I believe it's our teacher, Rav Ovadia, who basically said that the rabbis invented Friday night dinner. And so you're allowed to make use of Shabbat candles. That's why Rashi says, for example, you should have them in every room. That they're not decorative, they're not symbolic. They're there to keep you literally from bumping into each other. He calls it from shlom bayit, which in this case means don't bump into each other. That's Shabbos candles. Hanukkah candles are symbols, and you're not allowed to make use, derive benefit from a symbol. So you need another candle there so that you can use that one, again, in a room that otherwise has no lights on it. V'ika medura la tzarich. But if you have a bonfire, you don't need this extra candle because you've got the bonfire to see by. Now, of course, today the shamash itself has become symbolic, but that's, welcome to the world of ritualizing Judaism. V'i adam chashuvhu, if he's an important person who's unaccustomed to using the light of a bonfire, in other words, he can afford candles. Afal gav de'ika medurat tzarich ner acheret. Now he needs another one because he's not going to use a bonfire. He's used to having candles. So there's an actual legit fear that he might make use of the Hanukkah candles, which he shouldn't do. Okay, so now we've got some of the basic halacha down. Now the Gemara, I won't say it goes weird, but it goes weird. My Hanukkah. It's actually the name of the sugya. What's Hanukkah? You think you're already in the middle of a discussion about the thing. You wouldn't have to actually tell people what is it. But nope, they ask what it is. The Tanu Rabbanan, so now they bring a baraita, which says, B'kaf he bechislev, Yomei de Chanukah tamanya inun. So this is weird that you have a baraita that's in Aramaic. So I'm not quite sure what to do with this. I actually haven't looked up Megillat Ta'anit, which I should for reasons elsewise. We'll get to at the end. So on the 25th of Kislev, the days of Hanukkah are 8. Delal mispad behon, udelal hit anot behon. That you don't deliver eulogies at funerals, and you don't fast upon them. That's it. That's the original Hanukkah. And you're going, from this they made the Jewish Christmas. From this we get all you get Chabad with Chanukiot on top of their SUVs and minivans instead of antlers. I'd like to see one with both, but that's another story. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So now you have the Talmud telling you a story. Now you get to quasi-Agadah. It's Agadah. So let's see what they do with this. When the Greeks entered into the temple court, Tima'u kol hashemanim shebahechal, they rendered impure all of the oil in the courtyard, as if that was the only thing they did. And what the word Greeks here mean is itself a big question. Was this a war against the Syrian Greeks? Was this a civil war? What's, and the evidence going back and forth on it, it's kind of clunky. And when the Hasmonean monarchy grew strong and defeated them, as if there already was a pre-existing thing called the Hasmonean monarchy, which in fact was created by this war and in response to this war. They checked and they only found a single vial, single cruse of oil that had placed on it the signet seal of the high priest. By the way, I assume you can all unmute yourselves. If you got questions, throw them in, or we'll get to the end, we'll do questions.
I do have a question, Rabbi.
Please, Shana.
How do you know that that's a baraita? Is it because of the Tanu Rabbanan?
It's actually, yeah, right, Tanu Rabbanan.
So yeah. That always means it's a baraita?
I believe that always means it's a baraita. Although again here, and again, I in my ignorance, I did not go check Megillat Ta'anit.
Okay, because I'm still having a little difficulty when I'm studying Talmud, knowing.
Yeah, I believe so. I should know so. Yeah, I believe so. I should know so.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, we'll get to Megillat Ta'anit when I bring numismatics into play here. That's what we'll do the fun stuff at the end. So they found a single vial of oil that was properly stored away. And there was only sufficient oil to light for a single day. So of course they lit it. in this story. By the way, does the oil need to have the signet of the high priest? Maybe, maybe
No,
not.
it doesn't.
It
There
doesn't.
was no need for them to wait. They could have just lit.
Well, they didn't wait. That's part of their fanaticism. They didn't wait to get the next, to wait for the next batch to come through. They drew it down to the last drop. All right. Na'asa bones v'hidliku mimenu shemona yamim. So a miracle was wrought for them, and they lit from that single vial of oil for 8 days. L'shana acheret kiva'um ve'asaum yamim tovim b'halel v'hoda'ah. The literally another year, but the year following, they established and made these days as yontifs, as holidays, in singing and rejoicing. And that ends the Talmudic story of Hanukkah. Notice it's not missing, but it's almost missing. There's almost no warfare going on. There's no talk about war, or very little. And in fact, the thing being commemorated isn't the war. It's not even the rededication of the temple itself, which is being celebrated. It's this story about a vial of oil that lasts for 8 days. So the Talmud is written about the year 770. It takes 100 years or so for it to come into the form that we have it. So call it 670 to 770, right? And the story of Hanukkah takes place when? Venture a guess?
135?
I didn't hear you.
155?
Yeah, 155, thereabouts, BCE, before the Christian era, the Common Era. So we're talking not quite 1,000 years between the events being described in this text and the text that we have in front of us. So this whole story of the vial of oil that lasts 8 days, this is the first written occurrence of that narrative.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's true Agadah.
It's, well, it's so in the sense of the word that it's Agadah, whether it's the historicity of it matters to some people. It sure doesn't matter to me. And is it possible that this reflects traditions going back 900, 1,000 years? It's possible. Is it likely? Those who understand will understand. And those who are truly wise will remain silent. So that's the story we have here. So we have this crazy rabbinic holiday that's not created out of nothing. It's in fact transformed. And by the way, when people go, wait, but Hanukkah's not in the Bible. It's not in our Bible because we didn't include the book of Maccabees, but it is in the Christian Bible twice. Because at least the Catholics accept the book of Maccabees as canonical. The Protestants don't. It's in a series of books called the Apocrypha. So the Catholics, and I believe the Eastern Orthodox, accept Maccabees as part of their canon of the Bible. The Jews didn't, though the rabbis read it. And in fact, we're going to read it. But Hanukkah is itself directly mentioned in the Christian Bible, namely the Gospel of John, chapter 10. And we've got a couple of different translations of it here, and they all say essentially the same thing. At that time, the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, the Chanech is to dedicate, took place at Jerusalem, and it was winter. Note that this is clearly for an audience that doesn't know what Hanukkah is. Because do you need to tell anybody in the room here that Hanukkah is the Feast of Dedication and that it happens in the winter? So clearly the target audience of this text is not practicing, not even rabbinic Judaism, it's not practicing Judaism. Just as by the way, when you're reading a text, always look at who the perspective of the writer, the intended target audience. So, okay. So let's look at Maccabees. And Maccabees actually, which is not quite contemporary, but a lot closer to the events. So let's take a look at what they think Hanukkah is about and how it comes to be. So let's start at 43. And they cleansed the holy places and took away the stones that had been defiled into an unclean place. They defiled the altar and the rest of the place. And he considered about the altar of offerings that had been profaned, what he should do with it. This is Judas Maccabeus. And a good counsel came into their minds to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them, because the Gentiles had defiled it. So they threw it down. They dismantled what was left of the altar in the temple in Jerusalem. And they laid up stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place till there should come a prophet and give an answer concerning them. So what do you do with the stones? They're dedicated, they're Kodesh. It's one of the holiest places is the actual altar and the actual temple. So you can't use them because they've been defiled. They've been used arguably for idolatrous purposes, but you can't just desacralize them. So, there are places in the Talmud where it says, Elijah will come and tell us what to do. So we can't logically figure out what to do now. So we have to wait for a prophet to come and tell us what to do. Notice, by the way, even in this text, prophecy is gone. That way of getting what to do from God, that's, the screen's gone dark. So you only have logic and you have common sense. Then they took whole stones according to the law. In other words, no knives cut them, just whole rocks, and built a new altar according to the former. And they built up the holy places and the things that were within the temple. And they sanctified the temple and the courts. And they made new holy vessels and brought in the candlestick and the altar of incense and the table into the temple. And they put incense upon the altar and lit up the lamps that were upon the candlestick, and they gave light in the temple. So you're already beginning to get some hearkening of the light connection, but it's tenuous. And they set loaves upon the table and hung the veils and finished all the works that they had begun to make. In other words, this is very much unlike the dedication of the Mishkan in the desert, where it comes together at once on the 8th day. Notice the connection there too. It's not like the first temple of Solomon, which again gets dedicated all at once. It's not even in some ways like the first version of the second temple, where they it's a much smaller scale, but they bring it together all at once. This gets done ad hoc. The story in Maccabees is that they took their spears and tied them together and made a menorah out of that, out of tin. And then they got wealthier. So they made it out of silver. Then they made it out of gold. In other words, they did what they could. Very Jewish. And they arose before the morning on the 25th of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, in the 148th year. And they offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of offerings which they had made, according to the time and according to the day wherein the heathens had defiled it. In the same day was it dedicated anew with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. In other words, the reason why they picked the 25th, according to First Maccabees, is because not that's the day they came to the temple. That was the anniversary of the destruction, as it were, of the second temple. So they rededicated it on the very day that it had been destroyed. It had been defiled. So that's one connection to why 8 days, because it harkens back to Exodus and Leviticus. it's also, in some ways, I think, connected to their inability to celebrate Sukkot. Everybody here familiar with the concept of second Passover? There's, in the Torah, I can pull it up if need be, there are people who are ritually impure on the day of Passover. And they come to Moses and they go, we were ritually impure through no fault of our own. The rabbis say they were involved in burying a corpse, which of course is obligatory. But now, because you're in contact with a corpse, now you can't offer the sacrifice. So, hey, why can't we celebrate Passover too? And so Moses, like any good rabbi who doesn't know the answer, goes and asks his teacher. So Moses goes, yo, God, what's up? And God tells him that for somebody who's either ritually impure or on a long journey far away from the sanctuary, so they can't do it, they do it the next month. And thus we have the notion of Pesach Sheni, of second Passover. You couldn't do it the first time, you get a second shot. And the rabbis actually say that had the Israelites asked for a second version of all the other holidays, God would have granted them that too. But they didn't ask. Okay, so now, because there's a war going on, they can't celebrate Sukkot properly. So what did they do once they'd won? They said, well, we can't do Sukkot, but we can do something that kind of harkens back to Sukkot. So we're going to keep second Sukkot in the middle of Kislev instead of in the middle of Tishrei. And that's the origin of Hanukkah. So how you get to this 25th, I'm sure Haim will say it also has to do very much with the winter solstice and Saturnalia, the same way Christmas has that same, and there's no doubt about it. So this then begs the question, why would the rabbis, I would argue, failing to put the kibosh on Hanukkah, why would they transform it from a holiday about military victory, rededicating the temple? That part they kept, but what happened to the Hasmoneans? What happened to Judah Maccabee? They're not in the Talmudic story. Okay, there's barely a mention of them.
Fear of retribution.
Fear of retribution, that's part of it. That the rabbis understood, so it's either fear of retribution or fear of militarism. And they're not exact. One's a pre facto, one's an after the fact. So the fear of retribution is if the Gentiles find out that we've been a rebellious bunch since time immemorial, that we have a holiday celebrating our throwing off the yoke of the heathens, they're going to hate us. They're going to mistreat us. That's the fear-based version of it.
Could I ask a question about that's kind of related?
Sure.
You mentioned Pesach Sheni.
Yeah.
And the connection of the 8 days with the fact that the Israelites weren't able to celebrate Sukkot that year.
Yep.
There's a story, I want to say it's in Chronicles, where the Israelites celebrate Pesach after they find the Torah and they extend it for an extra 7 days.
Yep.
That's what I had in mind. Do the rabbis ever make that connection between these two instances?
I don't think they do it with Hanukkah.
Or not with Hanukkah particularly, but with the reason why they celebrated Hanukkah being that they wanted to celebrate Sukkot, and so there's some type, the precedence argument.
Yeah, like, hey, I mean, they don't, as far as I know, and this is, this may just be the ignorance of my knowledge on this. They don't say so explicitly, but the idea that they had a basis on which to say, yeah, doing a holiday not on its normal time, we can do that. Mm-hmm. And we can do that without a prophet telling us God wants us to do that. Mm-hmm. So by the way, I mean, we didn't talk, the whole finding the scroll of the law of the Lord in Chronicles. What exactly is that talking about? Mm-hmm. What's going on with that? But that's I don't want Haim to call me a koifer only after the fact. I want him to be here to participate in the heresy, as it were.
But can I
Rabbi, now that
jump
you
in there?
mention-
Oh, sorry.
Please.
Oh, go ahead. Stop.
Well,
ahead,
I
Dr.
kind of wanted to follow up on what you said, Shayna, that I think that the fear of retribution could have been quite real because Charlemagne, right? He was around right at that time. If you're talking that this might have been written around 770, right? That's
But it's
the
written in
era.
Babylonia. It's in Babylonia. It's we're not talking France and Germany.
But wouldn't they have been aware?
Maybe.
Actually, I had
the idea of not focusing on the military battle, you can say that that's a response to fear of persecution. What I didn't get was the second part of it, which is, I think, actually what the rabbis are up to. And that is,
well, I think,
go ahead, Shayna, please.
yeah, I'm changing my thought a little bit. I said the fear of retribution, but then it occurred to me, it's more a fear of what the people might do. Because this is now being written past Bar Kokhba.
Oh,
and
you
when
bet.
Bar Kokhba came around, Akiva based his fact on the Maccabees, that the Maccabees won, so therefore we can win.
That's
But
right.
the political situation was so different at that time between the Greeks and the Romans that they couldn't win. So if they're sitting here now in the 8th century or 7th century, there could be a fear of actually an independence movement that then could cause fighting with whoever it was at that time.
Which would be a disaster. And that's exactly what I think the rabbis are doing. They look at warfare and they're going, unless you're the Undertaker, nobody benefits from it. They're learning the lessons of the first revolt, which ended in minor disaster, a minor disaster of the destruction of your temple and your national governance. And then the Bakba Rebellion, with the deaths of literally 1 million Jews. People miss this. Until the Holocaust, the Bakba Rebellion was the most deadly moment for the Jewish people, far worse than the Spanish Inquisition, as devastating as that was. Bakba Rebellion almost wiped out Judaism. And so they saw this and they said, we want to put the kibosh on any sort of militarism. And so we've got this holiday that celebrates militarism, and we can't get rid of it. So we have to reinvent it. And so they set about doing that. And until the rise of the modern Zionist movement, where Judah Maccabee became a thing, it worked. And we'll see in the text we do next week just how well it worked. I think there's something else to it. And that is the particular relationship between the rabbis and the Hasmoneans, who are the successors of the Maccabees. That the Hasmoneans, as you read the Al-Hanisim, and it talks about the priests. So in Judaism, you've always had separation of powers. After all, Judaism doesn't know the difference between religion and politics. In this sense, we're very much like the Muslims. There's no distinction. So you have Keter Torah, the crown of Torah, or the Sanhedrin, and you have Keter Malchut, the monarchy, and you have Keter Kehuna, the priesthood. And there are 3 locuses of power. The Hasmoneans fused them. And the rabbis didn't like it because it led to a failed state. So I don't know if you can you see me now? Or I don't know if I'm on screen or not. Okay, so this, I don't know if you can see it or not. Well, so this is the actual coin. Here's an image of it. Let me share screen so you can actually see it. That is a 1 pruta coin issued by King Alexander Yanai, one of the middle Hasmonean kings. So the interesting thing about this Alexander Yanai, also known as Yehonatan, the high priest, is that he issued coins in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and in some cases, They've been overstamped for reasons which numismatists to this day are still trying to understand why that would happen. Different target markets. So the interesting thing about this guy's coinage is, can you read it? I know the coin isn't in great shape, but can you read the letters? And you're going, that doesn't even look like Hebrew. And you're right. It's not modern Hebrew. It's inscribed in Canaanite script, which hadn't been used at this point in hundreds of years. So why would you write your coinage literally in a language that nobody can read? Well, if most of your people can't read anyway, because the idea of public education is only being invented now by King Alexander's brother-in-law, better known as Shimon ben Shetach, whole story there. But, oh, these coins are written in the same script as the monarchy that King David used and the original Israelite monarchy. Oh, yeah, so these kings are just as legitimate as the monarchs from the legitimate Davidic line. And the rabbis who actually had members who were from the former royal family, like the Nasi'im, are going, okay, sure. So by the way, there's a whole thing which I'll do at some point on, there's a in Megillat Ta'anit, there's a list of holidays. Let me stop sharing again. There's a list of Jewish holidays that the rabbis added to. One of them is the 2nd of Tishrei, which today is a fast day. It's called Tzom Gedalia. But the rabbis instituted it as a feast, as a yontiv, to celebrate removing God's name from the coinage. And people, since the time of this text, were going, what's it talking about? Well, it turns out that Yehonatan, aka King Alexander Yanai, inscribed his coins with his name in Canaanite, Yud, He, Vav, Nun, Tav, Nun, Yehonatan. Except Yud, He is one of the names of God. And the rabbis at that time didn't like it. And so they basically started a rebellion until he changed the coinage to take the God's name off the coins. So today, yes, imagine somebody starting a war because they didn't like "In God We Trust" on the coinage and on the paper money. So yeah, here's the religious people who want "In God We Trust." Here it was the rabbis secularizing their money. The other thing is, they saw the Hasmoneans and the Herodian successors as a failed state. Because one of the things they had to do to keep the Greeks at bay was bring in this young upstart guy named Pompey and bring the Romans into Judean politics with disastrous results at the end. At the beginning, the rabbis were actually pro-Roman. And we see a lot of going back and forth, even in some ways, especially as we get to the Civil War and the war of 66 to 70. But they looked back on the history and said, Judaism as a political religion doesn't work that well. At least it didn't work that well the last time we tried it. So yeah, as Shana, as you put it correctly, we don't want to start an independence movement because there's no guarantee it's going to work. I was at a Shabbos dinner where I met a physician from Biafra. Anybody ever heard of Biafra? It was part of Nigeria that rebelled shortly after independence from the British. 1 million children died during the Biafran conflict. Fortunately, this physician wasn't one of them, but right, could have gone the other way. And in fact, it did go the other way for the Israelites. This was a military defeat so devastating, the combination of the first revolt and the Bar Kokhba revolt, that we were off the political map for 1700, 1800 years. It's a long time to be out of politics. But in some ways, that was intentional. And so the rabbis had to create something new. And so they did. They transformed this holiday from being not about external battles and dedication of a building, which now lay in ruins, but of dedication. That's all I've got.
Well, if you could explain a little bit more, like the whole Agadah part of this, because from what you've just presented, everything we know of Hanukkah is coming from this Agadah, pretty much, except for the lighting of the one candle.
Right. I mean, so I don't know the actual history of what went down. We have the witness texts of Maccabees. We have Josephus, who's of course writing hundreds of years later. And he has a huge political bias, namely he's working for the Romans and he's writing to a Greco-Roman audience. So, you know, take all sources with a grain of salt, particularly Josephus. Okay, so just because a story's made up doesn't mean it's not true. You may have to ask yourself, what's the truth that it's getting at? Okay, that it may be that it's simply trying to just, even if it's a small bit, the memory of a temple that once stood. So that's clearly not the holiday that's being celebrated, you know, as described in the book of John, because you then have a temple still standing. So that Hanukkah is dedication of a building that's still around, and you have a political situation that's not great. You have the end of the Herodian monarchy, the successors to the Hasmoneans. So you have direct Roman rule, but you know, it's okay, kind of. But then you fast forward a couple hundred years, and that's not something you can celebrate. It just doesn't work. So what do? We can either just say we're done. We're gonna suppress this holiday, like many other holidays that fell into disuse. I mean, anybody here fast the last day of the Jewish month before Rosh Chodesh?
No.
Don't all jump at once. It's actually a holiday. Yom Kippur Katan, the little Yom Kippur. I'm sure there are a few dozen, maybe a few hundred people in the world who do it. Most people have never heard of this holiday, but it was there and it didn't work. And so it got abandoned. I like to say Judaism is good at abandoning bad ideas or ideas that just don't work anymore by the side of the road, eventually. By the way, so let me ask you a consistency question. There's the idea that the rabbis try to maintain intellectual consistency. So we have this thing called second day of a Jewish holiday, right? Everybody familiar with it?
Yom Tov Sheni.
Yom Tov Sheni, right? So we keep, even though the Torah says one day of Passover, you keep 2 days. And on the 8th day, even though presumably we know when Rosh Chodesh was, you keep 2 days of that. And Shavuot, even though it's 49 days later, you still keep 2 days of it. Again, consistency. Rosh Hashanah for different reasons, 2 days. Sukkot, 2 days. Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah, 2 days, right? Yom Kippur, 2 days, right? Not so much. Lest you think nobody ever did that. There actually was a group in France who tried to do 2 days of Yom Kippur. I don't know how many times they did it. Okay, it's like the joke in the culinary world. All mushrooms are edible, some only once. So this may be something you can do, but you can only do it once. But so that was a bad idea. It was a good idea. You want to maintain consistency, so you keep Yom Tov Sheni even for fast days. Except it didn't work, and so that idea got left by the side of the road in fairly short order. Okay,
So
Go.
If I can just make sure I understand one of your main points. So you were
Yeah.
saying the rabbis changed the holiday from a remembrance of the military victory to a remembrance of the temple,
Yeah, very much.
and why was it that you were saying there was no Jewish writing about this for 1,000 years?
There was no the whole story of the candles of the light burning for 8 days.
Specifically that aspect.
Specifically that narrative. There's writing about Hanukkah. I mean, like I said, it's mentioned in Maccabees. It's mentioned in the Christian Bible. It's mentioned in Josephus. It's mentioned in the Mishnah. We have they did Hanukkah. How they did Hanukkah, why they did Hanukkah, is unclear. Because after all, you look at the first Baraita we read on it. What's the essential thing of these 8 days? Is no eulogies at funerals. People still die. You still have to bury them, but no eulogies, because eulogies were they made you cry more than you had to, and so that was somehow incompatible with this being a day of joy. So you didn't have a public eulogy, and no fasting. The same as on other Jewish holidays. You're not allowed to fast during Chol HaMoed Pesach or Chol HaMoed Sukkot, because these are supposed to be days of joy, and and fasting is incompatible with joy. So you don't fast on Hanukkah. That's it. That was the beginning and the end.
8 days, or was it
Again?
1 day? At that point, was it 8 days or was it 1 day when they were talking about the fasting?
So Maccabees refers to it being an 8-day holiday. So I'm willing to buy it. Again, why did they choose that particular day? You know, the Talmud itself is silent on it. My guess is that this was the first day they were able to, the war had finished. And so that became the day. The version in Maccabees makes sense also. That you're davka going to take the day that your temple was destroyed, for lack of better terms. That you had to remove the very stones of the altar because you couldn't use it anymore. That's it may be spiritual destruction, but that's still destruction. And create a new altar from new stones. So the day that they did this to us, we're going to make that into a yontif. That that resonates. The idea that it was simply that was the first time when the rabbis, is it in the Talmud? This is they read Hanukkah as Hanu Kaf He. They came to rest on the 25th. That was when the war was finally over. And now they began the process of rededicating the defiled temple in Jerusalem. Okay, different reasons, same day for sure. Is it okay to see Hanukkah in the context of trying to compete with Saturnalia and
Right.
Christmas? You
Right.
bet. You bet.
Right.
Judaism was and is competing in the marketplace of ideas, especially in the Roman Empire. To say it could have gone the other way. Here's a fun question for you. What if Emperor Constantine had embraced Judaism instead of Christianity? What would the world look like? Yeah. There's a counterfactual history essay on that very topic, and it's a fun read. But yeah, there are lots of things that it could have gone the other way in world history. What if the carriers had been at port at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941? Now there's a counterfactual history you don't want to think about, because if it were, we'd be probably doing this class in Japanese, but that's another story. Okay, before I get myself into trouble, I'm going to stop recording. Hang on a sec.